I trusted her with everything I had, my savings, my accounts, my entire retirement. And while I slept peacefully in the house I'd worked 40 years to own, my own daughter was emptying it all. My name is Vivian Hartley. I'm 68 years old. I live in a small house in Asheville, North Carolina, the same house my late husband Gerald and I bought in 1989. I raised my children in that house. I cooked Thanksgiving dinners in that kitchen for 31 years. I planted the rose bushes out front with my own hands. I'm not a wealthy woman. I'm not someone who had family money or inheritance to fall back on. Everything I had, every single dollar, I earned. I worked as a school district administrator for 37 years. I clipped coupons. I packed lunches. I drove a used car for 14 years because I refused to take on unnecessary debt. Gerald and I scrimped and saved so that when the time came, we could retire with dignity, so that we wouldn't be a burden to anyone. Gerald passed away 4 years ago. Heart attack. No warning. Just here one morning and gone by afternoon. And after the grief settled, the real, bone-crushing grief that nobody tells you about, I was alone for the first time in my adult life. Alone and suddenly responsible for every financial decision by myself. That's when my daughter Renee stepped in. And I want you to understand something about Renee before I go any further, because this story doesn't make sense without understanding who she was to me. Renee was my firstborn, my pride. She was the child who called me every Sunday without fail, the one who showed up on my birthday with flowers and stayed to help me do the dishes afterward. She was charming and put together and smart in the way that makes other mothers jealous. She had a good job in financial services, which, looking back, is one of the cruelest ironies of this entire story. She was my daughter, and I would have died for her. The financial takeover didn't happen all at once. I want to be very clear about that, because when people hear stories like mine, they sometimes think, how did you not notice? How could you not see it? And the answer is that it was slow. Deliberately, patiently, expertly slow. It started about 6 months after Gerald died. I was still in the fog of grief. The kind where you go to the grocery store and come home with nothing you actually needed because you couldn't remember why you went in the first place. I was forgetting appointments, missing bill due dates. Nothing catastrophic, but enough that I mentioned it to Renee one Sunday on the phone, almost in passing. I told her I'd nearly missed my property tax payment and that I'd been feeling scattered. She was at my door 2 days later. She sat across from me at my kitchen table with that warm, concerned expression she wore so well, and she said, "Mum, I've been worried about you. You've got a lot on your plate. You're grieving. You shouldn't have to be managing all of this alone." She suggested she help me get organised, go through the accounts, set up autopay for the bills, maybe become a joint account holder so she could step in if there was ever an emergency. I remember thinking how lucky I was. What a good daughter. What a blessing. I signed the paperwork that same week. I handed her access to the savings account, the account that held my entire retirement fund. $342,000, built over 4 decades. I handed her the login information. I signed her name onto my checking account. I gave her power of attorney for financial matters, just in case. I gave her all of it because she was my daughter and I trusted her completely. And I want you to really sit with that for a moment. Because I know some of you watching right now have done something similar. You've handed your finances over to a child because it made sense. Because you were tired or grieving or just relieved that someone was willing to help. There is no shame in that. There is no foolishness in trusting the person you raised and loved for decades. The shame belongs entirely to the person who betrays that trust. For the first several months, everything seemed fine. My bills were paid on time. Renee would come over once a month, sit with me at the table and go over what she called a financial summary, a printed page she'd bring showing my account balances and recent transactions. She'd walk me through it, quickly, cheerfully, always with a cup of coffee in hand and a reason to rush off somewhere afterward. I didn't look closely. Why would I? She was handling it. That was the whole point. She started doing things I thought were kind at the time. She suggested I didn't need to keep a running checkbook anymore. Everything's digital now, Mum. It's just extra stress. She gently redirected me when I tried to log into my own online banking. I set up some new security features. Let me walk you through it when I have more time. She moved the paper statements to a folder she kept at her house for organisation. I stopped having direct visibility into my own accounts. Again, this happened gradually. There was no single moment where I handed over control and said, I don't want to see my accounts anymore. It was a slow, gentle erosion. Every step had a reason. Every reason sounded caring. She called it simplifying things for me. I called it a relief. I was wrong to call it that. Looking back, there were signs. There are always signs. I just had explanations for every single one of them. The first sign came about 8 months into the arrangement. I asked Renee about taking a small trip, just to visit my college roommate out in Colorado. I'd wanted to go for years, and I figured I had the money. I asked Renee if we could look at the budget together. She hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. Then she smiled and said that my accounts were in a transitional phase because she'd moved some money into a higher yield investment vehicle on my behalf, and that pulling funds right now wouldn't be ideal. I didn't take the trip. I told myself she was being smart with my money. The second sign came around month 11. My furnace died in January. Classic bad timing. And the repair was going to cost just over $2,000. I told Renee I'd need to pull from savings. She came over that same evening, flustered in a way I hadn't seen before, and told me she'd take care of it. She wrote a personal check to the repairman herself. I thought that was generous. I thanked her. I said I'd pay her back. She told me not to worry about it. I now know exactly why she told me not to worry about it. The third sign, and this one I'm still ashamed I missed, was a comment her brother made. My son, David. He's a quiet man, not one to stir things up, but one evening he called me out of the blue and asked, carefully, whether I was comfortable with how Renee was handling my accounts, whether I felt like I still had access and visibility. I told him absolutely. I told him Renee was wonderful. I told him I didn't know what I'd do without her. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, Mum, just checking." I later learned he'd noticed Renee had bought a new car and renovated her kitchen within the same calendar year, on a salary that, to his knowledge, shouldn't have covered both. He didn't say any of that to me then. He didn't want to upset me. He thought maybe he was being paranoid. He wasn't. I need you to understand something about how this ended up getting discovered, because it wasn't clever detective work. It wasn't some elaborate trap. It was a single piece of paper that arrived in the mail on a Tuesday afternoon in October. A bank statement. Renee had switched my paper statements to electronic, but apparently she had missed one account. An older savings account I'd had since the early 90s, one I'd nearly forgotten about. It still had a paper statement on file. And that October, that statement landed in my mailbox. I almost threw it away without opening it. I was expecting junk mail. But something made me pause. I looked at the envelope. It had my name on it, the return address of my bank, and something, some quiet instinct I can't fully explain, made me sit down at the kitchen table and open it. The beginning balance for the period read $214,000. The ending balance read $47,800. I stared at that page for so long that the numbers stopped making sense. I picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. There were 18 transactions listed over 3 months, transfers, all of them transfers. Each one between $2,000 and $15,000. Every single one of them going to the same destination account. An account I didn't recognize. An account that was not mine. My hands were shaking. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set the paper down on the table and press both palms flat against the surface just to steady myself. I sat in my kitchen for a very long time. And then I picked up the phone. Not to call Renee, to call my bank. I spoke to a customer service representative named Janet. I remember her name because she was kind in the specific way that people are kind when they realise something is very wrong and they're trying not to alarm you. I explained that I had a paper statement in front of me showing large transfers I didn't recognise. I asked her to help me understand what accounts were connected to mine, who had authorisation to make transfers, and where those transfers had gone. There was a pause. Then Janet said, "Mrs. Hartley, I think you need to speak to our fraud and account security team. I'm going to transfer you right now." That's when I knew. Not suspected, knew. The security specialist, a man named Robert, was measured and methodical and very, very careful with his words. He walked me through the transaction history on every account I held at that bank. What he described to me over the next 40 minutes was staggering. $180,000. Gone. Transferred out of my accounts over the course of 14 months. Not all at once, never all at once. Small enough amounts, spaced carefully, spread across multiple accounts, that no single transaction triggered an automatic fraud alert. Whoever had done this understood how banking security systems worked. They understood thresholds. They understood how to stay invisible. And they had my login information, my account numbers, and my power of attorney. Robert asked me if I knew who had been managing my accounts. I told him my daughter had. Another pause. Then he said, very gently, "Mrs. Hartley, I strongly recommend you come into a branch in person as soon as possible. And I would advise you not to alert anyone who has access to your accounts before you do." I hung up the phone. I sat in my kitchen until the sun went down. I want to try to explain what that night was like, because I think it matters. I think it's the part of this story that people gloss over. The hours between the discovery and the action. Those hours are real. They're heavy in a way that I still carry. I didn't cry right away. I didn't rage. I just sat there in the dark kitchen and thought about Renee. I thought about the Sunday phone calls. I thought about the flowers on my birthday. I thought about the way she'd held my hand at Gerald's funeral. I thought about a moment when she was 7 years old and had run a fever, and I'd sat beside her bed all night holding a cold cloth to her forehead because she'd been frightened. I had loved that child since before she was born. I had rearranged my entire life around loving her. And somewhere between that little girl with the fever and this October night, something had broken in her so badly that she had looked at her grieving mother's retirement savings and seen an opportunity. That's not a thought that resolves quickly. It doesn't fit neatly into any category of emotion you already know. It's its own kind of grief. Quieter than losing Gerald, but somehow more corrosive. Because Gerald didn't choose to leave me. Renee did. I also want to say something to you, whoever is watching this right now, and maybe recognising pieces of your own situation in mine. If you are sitting somewhere right now feeling like something is wrong, trust that feeling. I dismissed mine for over a year. I explained it away. I told myself I was being cynical about a good person who loved me. Please don't make that mistake. Your gut is not being cynical. Your gut is paying attention. The next morning, I was at the bank when it opened. I had barely slept. I'd spent most of the night pulling together every piece of financial documentation I could find in my house. Old account statements I'd saved, tax returns, a copy of the power of attorney document, anything that could establish a timeline. I put it all in a manila folder and I drove myself to the First National branch on Merriweather Street at 8:45 in the morning. I asked to speak with the branch manager, Her name was Carolyn, and she was the kind of no-nonsense woman I immediately felt I could trust. She looked at my folder, she pulled up my accounts on her screen, she made some notes, and then she looked at me and said, without any softening at all, "Mrs. Hartley, what has happened to your accounts constitutes elder financial fraud. I want you to know that very clearly. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a crime." I had told myself that, alone in my kitchen the night before, but hearing it said out loud, plainly, by another person, it made it real in a different way. Carolyn walked me through the process of revoking all access to my accounts. She helped me change every password, every security question, every authorization. She flagged my accounts for monitoring. And then she personally walked me through the steps to file a report. She said, "I'd recommend you go directly to the police today. And I'd also recommend calling Adult Protective Services. They have investigators who specialize in exactly this kind of case." I asked her, and I'm not embarrassed that I asked this, whether filing a police report meant Renee would be arrested. Carolyn looked at me with the kind of gentleness that doesn't condescend and said, "That depends on the investigation. But yes, Mrs. Hartley, this could lead to charges." I nodded. I picked up my folder. I thanked her, and I drove to the police station. Before I tell you what happened next, and I promise we are getting to the moment where everything changes, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. I share stories like this because I believe they matter, because they protect women like us. You never know whose life a story like mine might reach at exactly the right time. Filing a police report is not the dramatic scene you might imagine. There are no flashing lights or urgent voices. It's a fluorescent lit room, and a form, and a detective who types slowly and asks questions in a flat, professional tone. The detective assigned to my case was named Harris, Detective Paul Harris. He was in his early 50s, methodical, and thorough in a way that gave me confidence. He had me walk through the entire timeline from the beginning. When I handed him the bank statement, that single piece of paper that had found its way to my mailbox against all odds, he looked at it for a long moment and then looked at me. He said, "You mentioned your daughter has a background in financial services?" I said yes. He made a note. He asked me about the power of attorney document. He asked whether Renee had made any large purchases recently that I was aware of. I told him about what David had mentioned, the car, the kitchen renovation. He made more notes. He told me the Financial Crimes Unit would take over the investigation and that I should expect to be contacted within a few days. He told me not to reach out to Renee, not to tell her I'd been to the bank or the police, and not to discuss the case with anyone who might alert her. He said, if she has any reason to believe she's been discovered, there's a risk she tries to move money or leave the area. I drove home, and I didn't call anyone. That was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Over the next 2.5 weeks, I existed in a kind of suspended reality. The investigation was happening somewhere behind the scenes, and I was walking through my regular days, grocery store, morning walks, Sunday church, with this enormous secret sitting in my chest. Renee called twice. Both times I answered. Both times I kept my voice steady and told her everything was fine. She mentioned she might come by that weekend to go over some paperwork with me. I told her that would be lovely. I hung up the phone and stood in my hallway with my heart hammering. Detective Harris called me 9 days into the investigation. The Financial Crimes Unit had completed their preliminary review. What they found was more extensive than even I had known from that one statement. Renee had not just accessed the old savings account. She had made transfers from my primary savings, my secondary checking, and an investment account I hadn't even known she had access to. She had falsified transfer authorizations. She had, on at least 3 occasions, forged my signature on documents. The total they'd confirmed? $183,000. Money that she had transferred into 2 accounts, one in her name, one in the name of a business entity she'd set up 18 months earlier. A business entity I had never heard of. A business entity that, as far as investigators could tell, existed for no purpose other than to receive and hold those funds. Detective Harris said the Financial Crimes Unit was prepared to move forward. They had enough for an arrest. He asked me if I had any questions. I asked only one. Does she know yet? He said, No, ma'am, she doesn't. I was not there when they arrested her. I had asked Detective Harris not to tell me exactly when it would happen, because I wasn't sure I could hold myself together through the wait if I knew. He respected that. I found out the way she never expected me to find out about anything. Through David. He called me at 6:47 on a Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee. He said, Mum, just that. Just my name. In a voice so strained and so careful that I already knew. I said, It's done, isn't it? He said, She was arrested this morning at her house. I set my coffee cup down. I didn't say anything for a moment, neither did he. Then David said, Mum, I need you to know, I'm so sorry I didn't push harder when I had my suspicions. I should have. I stopped him. I told him there was nothing for him to apologise for. I told him the only person responsible for what happened was Renee. I believed that then, and I believe it now. Renee was charged with elder financial abuse, grand larceny, forgery, and fraudulent use of power of attorney. Her accounts, both personal and business, were frozen immediately upon arrest. The funds were held pending the legal proceedings. There's something I haven't told you yet. Something that happened between the arrest and the court proceedings. And I've gone back and forth about whether to include it because it's the part of this story that still keeps me up at night sometimes. Renee called me from the county jail. She used her one call. She called me. I almost didn't answer. I stood there watching my phone ring, watching her name on the screen. And I thought about every moment over the past 14 months. Every, I'm handling it, Mum, and every glossy financial summary, and every time she'd redirected me from my own accounts with a smile. I thought about the furnace repair she'd paid for with my own stolen money. I thought about the investment account and the fake business entity and the forged signatures on documents carrying my name. And then I thought about that little girl with the fever and the cold cloth and the night I'd spent beside her bed. I answered. She was crying. I could hear it before she even said a word. And part of me, the part that had loved her for 41 years, wanted to absorb that sound the way I always had. Wanted to say, It's okay, baby. We'll figure it out. I'm here. But I didn't say that. She said, Mum, please. I made a terrible mistake. I can explain. Please don't do this. I want you to understand that what I said next was the hardest sentence I have ever spoken in my entire life. Harder than anything I said at Gerald's funeral. Harder than any conversation I've ever had. I said, Renee, I love you. I will always love you. But what you did was a crime, and I can't protect you from the consequences of a crime. And then I hung up. I sat down on the floor, right there in my hallway. The same hallway where I'd watched her walk out the door to her first day of kindergarten. And I cried harder than I have cried since Gerald died. Not because I regretted what I'd done, because it needed to be done at all. The case moved through the system over the following 8 months. I will not pretend this was easy or clean. Legal proceedings rarely are. There were depositions and documentation requests, and a preliminary hearing, and a period where Renee's attorney attempted to argue that I had given informed consent to all the transfers, that I'd been aware and approving of everything Renee had done with my money. That argument required my full testimony, which I gave. I sat in a chair across a conference table from my daughter, the first time I'd seen her since before the arrest, and I answered every question completely and truthfully. I looked at her once during that deposition, Just once. She looked smaller than I remembered. She didn't look angry. She looked, I thought, ashamed. I hope she was. Her attorney's argument went nowhere. The paper trail was too complete, the forgeries too documented, the fake business entity too blatant. When you work in financial services and you steal from your elderly mother, the forensic accountants can dismantle your trail piece by piece. And they did. Renee accepted a plea agreement. She pled guilty to elder financial abuse and grand larceny. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 2.5. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of the $183,000 with interest. Because her accounts had been frozen at arrest and the funds had not been dissipated, the majority of my money was recoverable. The recovery process took several months and wasn't without its complications. But in the end, between the frozen account funds, the liquidation of the business entity, and the restitution order, I recovered $161,000 of what she had taken. Not all of it, but most of it. The moment it became real to me wasn't the sentencing. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the sentencing, when I received a wire transfer confirmation from my bank. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd signed those account papers 2 years earlier, where I'd opened that October bank statement, where I'd spent that long, dark evening alone with the weight of what I'd discovered. The notification came through on my phone. I opened it. I looked at the number. I put the phone down on the table, and I sat there in the quiet of my house, and I thought, I did that. I found it. I reported it. I sat in that depositions chair and told the truth, and I didn't let love be used as a weapon against me. I thought about every woman who has been in a version of this situation and talked herself out of reporting it because she didn't want to be the mother who turned her child in. I thought about how close I came to doing exactly that, to putting the statement back in the envelope, to telling myself there must be an explanation, to protecting the person who was systematically destroying my security. I thought about that, and I picked the phone back up, and I looked at the number again. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt something that wasn't grief, or fear, or anger. My retirement savings are not what they were before Renee took over my accounts. They're close, closer than I ever thought they'd be, but the 2 years of recovery have cost me time and peace that I'll never get back. The rose bushes out front are still blooming. The house is still mine. My Sunday mornings are quieter now because there are no phone calls from her. But they are mine too. I share this story because the statistics on elder financial abuse in this country are devastating. And most of it goes unreported. Families protect families. Mothers protect daughters. And the people who commit these crimes know that. They count on it. Don't let them count on it. If something feels wrong with your finances, even if the person handling them is someone you would trust with your life, you have every right to look. You have every right to ask. You have every right to walk into your bank and say, "Show me everything." It is your money. It is your life. It is your retirement. I'm Vivian Hartley. I'm 68 years old and I live in Asheville, North Carolina. And I got my life back. Thank you for watching.